But since then, we've had, the Vietnam War, where the North Vietnamese, used, guerrilla warfare techniques and distributed attacks, and they used, they managed to get inside the American decision loop, and they, even though they were losing the last war, they won the current war.
Yes, quite right. Yeah, so this notion of a decision loop, or as the John Boyd, who's the American strategic theorist who came up with the concept, the OODA loop, OODA loop, is, I think, a concept that is very timely, and I think more and more people are going to begin grasping it. So, would it be useful to try to define it more rigorously right now?
Absolutely. What does OODA stand for those who've never come across it?
All right, so this is actually, as I mentioned, I think it's a very, very deep concept, and frankly, I think even the practitioners in the military who use it don't understand it well enough. So the idea is that the first O is observe, and we can think of observe as your capacity, which might be your organization or your team or your individual capacity, to pull information in from the universe. And by the way, your intuitive channel is part of that methodology. The more you're able to actually process things intuitively, the more bandwidth your O has. The second O is orient. The idea is that just being overwhelmed by a flood of information is not helpful. You have to actually be able to take that and turn that from information into meaning. So orientation is your capacity to make sense of what's coming in. And so if we're going to be tuning into our intuitive channel, we have to get better and better at listening to it and using it as a guide to then be making decisions, which is the third, the D, decide. Right? So decisions is taking sense and connecting sense to our action potentials. It's the bridge between what we perceive as being going on and how we are going to actually respond to it. Deciding is the narrowing function that then hands off to act. And the action piece, of course, is the agentic, the actuator, the refined ability that we have to express our energies into the world with the most impact, with the least effort, and with the least amount of externalization effects, the least sort of unanticipated consequences.
So
and the idea that Boyd has is the loop.
So what's the loop? You observe, orientate, decide, act, and then you repeat it all over again?
Right, because it's sort of reality or the universe outside of you comes in through observe and then exits through some kind of expression, some action or some change of behavior that you make in the world, which changes the state of the world, which then you observe. And interestingly enough, the common knowledge has it that the fastest OODA loop wins. And this is actually not true. The better understanding is that the OODA loop with the highest bandwidth wins, meaning that the one that can handle the most through it the fastest will win. Certain circumstances, having a very narrow band OODA loop, very rapid, is highly effective. But generally speaking, what you want to be able to do is be able to perceive, process, decide on, and act with the most potential in the shortest amount of time.
And at the same time, you want to slow down your opponent and cut their bandwidth.
Yes. So then in the game of strategy, if you are in fact interacting with other OODA loops, which we generally are, if you can do things to slow down or reduce the bandwidth of your opponent's OODA loop, then that's the other side of the equation, right? So net, the OODA loop with the highest bandwidth will win in any strategic contest. And so either you can increase yours or decrease your opponent.
So in business, we're observing what our competitors are doing. We're observing what is shifting in the technology and organizational technology. We're orientating ourselves as to where we're going to focus. We're deciding what we're going to do. We're taking action, changing a product, launching a new service, reorganizing our business a different way. And then we're repeating it and doing it over again. And then if we're a little devious, we're also trying to slow down our opponents or cutting down their bandwidth by cutting the amount of information they have available, or or exploiting the fact that they just don't process information so quick because maybe they have a hierarchical structure and they, only the top people in the organization do any of this and all the bottom people don't. Whereas in our organization, everyone's empowered to observe, orientate, and decide and act, and take decisions and move the business forward and get feedback. And that ability for the organization to make decisions quickly and change and maybe not have a coherent strategy, but in Zappos shoes, the customer service representatives are empowered to decide what's best for the customer, right? They don't have to take it up the hierarchy to find out what to do. They have a faster OODA loop to decide what to do that. And then this is part of the fact that the organization doesn't seem to have a consistent, strategy, but they make fast decisions that are good for their customers, could be confusing to the opposition because they don't quite know what they're doing, but they seem to be doing it better, right? That's a way to slow down their bandwidth because you're giving off so many different signals, they don't know what to focus on.
So there's a couple of really interesting things that are implicit because you use the phrase not having a coherent strategy. And what's amazing about that is the degree to which we have, because we grew up in the latter half of the 20th century broadly, we have mapped the word strategy to actually mean a strategic plan in the bureaucratic hierarchical mode, right? The kind of thing that a strategic planning organization creates, which is then disseminated.
Which is how World War II was won, right? That's the strategy that all the big companies copied out of World War II, that you have a hierarchy, you have a strategy, you use operational research techniques to optimize your strategy, but the individual soldiers just follow what they're told to do.
Right, and Boyd's point is that if you understand that OODA loop, the engineering a higher bandwidth OODA loop is strategy, that actually is what strategy really is, and that the approach that you just described quite well is an approach that optimized an OODA loop for the environment of the 1950s to the late 1970s, 80s. That's the deep insight. And so now that we're not in the 1980s, using the techniques of the 1980s and fighting the last war, so the question is, what is in fact the nature, the essence of actual strategic thinking and planning that is appropriate for a networked age?
And in my view, it's probably more distributed. It's probably people accessing their intuition as well as their rational mind.
Yeah.
And probably some other things I haven't even considered yet.
Well, I mean, we could take a couple of things that are more legible, which is, for example, the changing nature of supply chain. The ability to do logistics, outsource logistics, the ability to do very, very rapid experimental marketing through digital marketing and social media. These are just very tactical handheld techniques that effectively everybody is familiar with. And what these changes in the economic framework have done in the past several decades is they've enabled and also forced a shrinking of the nature of what the firm looks like. So instead of having to have ownership of my logistical function to be able to ship from where I am to where my customer is, I can outsource my logistical function to, and actually at this point, almost a cloud logistical function. I don't even know who's shipping my stuff anymore. I just provide it to a shipping service who makes sure that it gets to the end customer at effectively commodity cost. I no longer have to have a giant IT department that builds out my hosting and bandwidth function. I just outsource that to Amazon Web Services or to Google, and they optimize that. So what ends up happening is that my firm is empowered to shrink and become more and more focused on a smaller core competency, which then becomes a fluid component of a different kind of marketplace. And if I don't do that, if I sort of hold on to competencies that are not my core, I'm actually radically less capable than everybody around me, which is to say that my OODA loop is very slow because now I'm doing things that are obsolete. That Google has already fully optimized, and why the hell am I doing that? They've already done it perfectly. We just plug into what they're doing and take advantage of that. So this notion that the organizational structure, as you said, like the way the Wehrmacht reorganized and pushed authority out to a different class of soldiers, which meant that the higher ranks also had a different way of doing planning. The new organizational structure is going to be oriented around smaller groups that have very intense core competencies that find ways to then ally with and link with other equally small groups who have intense core competencies and to actually share their energy and their resources in a very fluid and very rapidly changing global marketplace.
And those teams may be fluid themselves. It may be there's a team this month to deal with a particular issue and succeed there, and then it disbands or reorganizes, and the people move to different teams. There may not be a permanent structure.
I'm noticing that in my own company.
Oh, well, cool. And this is actually an idea that was used in, I think it was Lockheed Martin in their Skunk Works, which they wanted to come up with some new technology to sell to the Army or the Air Force, and the traditional big hierarchical organization wasn't coming up with it, and they locked up these really clever engineers and gave them some budget, and they came up with some really new technology because they were separated from the rest of the organization. But I think that idea is going to invade the whole organization. We're going to have everything is going to be a skunk works. Everything will be creating amazing new inventions, but doing it in a temporary way for whatever needs doing in the moment.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think the challenge for people who think organizationally is going to be figuring out where the efficient frontier is. So it's unlikely that we'll be in a position where everybody has to be a stem cell, meaning that everybody has to sort of carry the full portfolio of capacities and skills. That doesn't seem likely to be efficient. There still needs to be division of labor and specialization, but it's certainly the case that the amount of division of labor and specialization is going to be a lot less than it was in the 1950s and 60s. And this notion of fluid recombinations of groups of individuals that cohere around some particular set of functions, optimize for it in a time frame where the optimization is valid, produce an artifact, flow it into the marketplace, and then maybe even disappear and recohere, more like the studio model. That's certainly being explored quite rapidly. And of course, we're living in an environment that, while it is changing very rapidly, there are also sort of forces of viscosity. Companies like, say, Microsoft or Lockheed Martin, who, because they control enough power, they have enough resources and enough influence over the environment, that they are trying to keep the niche. They're trying to keep the world conducive to their way of being. That you have these very interesting dynamics between the rate at which the past is fading and the rate at which the future is emerging. And as an entrepreneur, being able to flow in there. If your business is going to be interfacing with healthcare companies, like health insurance companies, that's going to require a very unique dynamic of connecting what you and I are talking about with dinosaurs. Like how do you actually interface with dinosaurs when you're a mammal? Or conversely, do you just go ahead and decide to become a pure play mammal and just launch something like 23andMe or Fitbit that goes straight to the end user and completely routes around the legacy infrastructure? And this maybe actually leads us all the way back to the initial conversation, which is the situational assessment, or the state of what's happening in the world right now.
Well, and I want to recommend people read that because although it's written geared towards political talk, you can reread the whole article as applied to what's going on in business. And there's, just if we're okay swimming a little bit deeper in the swimming pool of ideas here into deeper water, I hope we haven't drowned too many listeners so far. And then I promise we'll come back to shallow water for some actions that would make sense. Is that okay with you, Jordan? So I think one of the things I got from your situational assessment is that there is a world culture war going on. And I kind of labeled it, World Culture War II, a bit like World War II. But the thing is, unlike World War II, which, in the 1940s, I think most people knew World War II was actually going on. But just imagine you were an entrepreneur back then and you didn't even know there was a war. And you had your factory or business and you were going along and you were wondering, well, why aren't my employees working so good? And why has suddenly half my factory disappeared? I didn't even know bombs existed, Can you imagine how disruptive that would be for your business if you didn't even know the war was going on? And on the flip side, what an opportunity. Suppose you knew, there is a war going on and I could retool the business to help out my country in whatever way that could happen. Or however you adjust to it. Maybe you decided, I'm going to relocate my business to Latin America because I don't think that's going to be involved in this particular war. Many ways you could take it. But if you don't even know the world culture war is going on, you're kind of screwed.
Yeah, well, the example that just keeps coming home for me, because I lived it, was I didn't know that a global scale financial crisis was going on in 2007. I mean, I was along the ride with virtually everybody else, and it was. And if I had known, obviously I would have been able to make vastly better decisions. So the notion that we're currently immersed deeply in a culture war, and I think it is a world culture war, and that it's very difficult to understand because it's not at all like the culture war of the 60s. Some of it is
so the 60s were World Culture War I in this terminology?
Yes, that's a great way of putting it. Yeah, in fact, it may even be that there may actually be more than just a metaphor there. That may actually be a very close mapping. The 60s and 70s was World Culture War I, and to a greater or lesser extent, certainly in the West, in Western Europe, the United States, Japan, China, the Middle East sort of were a little bit shifted on that. And what was happening now is that the kind of the ripple effects of what happened in the West and what happened in the rest of the world are beginning to realign in what seems like a single World Culture War II. And what's happening is a number of different elements are aligning. So if we think about culture, it's not just being stuff like the prosaic stuff like fashion or the ideas that are having valence, or politics. We really think about culture as the nature of how we go about as individuals and groups making sense of the world, making sense of our identity, who we are, making sense of who we work with and how and why in terms of purpose, and then acting. Culture is a big piece of the framework of how we go about building our individual and group OODA loops. And what's happening right now is that big waves are pushing through global cultures, and they are disrupting all of the old ways of doing this. And they are giving rise to entirely new ways of doing it. So it's very akin to a very rapid shift from a jungle to a desert. And so what's happening is that there are surface artifacts. Like, for example, in the United States, we have this surface sense that there is some kind of red Republican Trump thing that we may map to saying, oh, it's the Republicans that we remember from the 1980s versus the Democrats that we remember from the 1980s. But that's actually not, I don't think, what's really happening. What's really happening, I think, is that there's more profound transitions that are going on under the surface, and that what I call the red religion or the insurgency, the Trump insurgency, have begun to form entirely new OODA loops, entirely new forms of collective intelligence that are more closely in alignment with the nature of the transformations that are going on below the surface, and in many ways only superficially resemble the Republicans of the Reagan era. If you actually sort of just did a straight semantic mapping, it's not particularly close. They just are kind of wearing that clothing because that just happens to be where they're able to get above the surface, but they're pulling some other new kind of cultural coherence driven by a more adaptive response to what's going on underneath the surface. And then so by contrast, this thing that I call the establishment and the blue church, which are related but not exactly the same, which the Democratic Party certainly is still closely connected with, they're fighting the last war. And this is one of the reasons why they're losing, in spite of the fact that they have a huge amount of resources, that they're doing something which is, in some sense, swimming against the current of these big changes that are going on underneath the surface. And one of these big changes is technical. Right? The shift from television and newspaper to the internet is a major shift, and the blue church is perfectly optimized for television and newspapers and is completely maladapted to social media. By contrast, the red religion, which is, again, not the Republicans of the Reagan era, is in many ways the consequence of social media, more so than even adapted to it, is an expression of social media that has begun to grasp means and cohere those means into what feels a little bit like something like a narrative that is now beginning to outcompete the blue church in this new emergent environment.
And this is somewhat analogous to the Vietnam War, where the American and South Vietnamese were fighting the last war. They had incredible, superiority in numbers of bombs and tanks and what have you. And, they had an organization based on the World War II kind of model that won World War II. But the North Vietnamese and the Viet Minh, they had a more nimble approach that had a faster OODA loop. And, they were able to totally destroy that, even though the establishment looked like they should have won.
Yes, that's exactly right. And it's important to recognize, for example, for anybody who wants to kind of get deeper into the actual history, the degree to which the Viet Minh and the Viet Cong were able to play with and connect with disruptive forces inside the American social cultural fabric, right? Because that was degrading the OODA loop of the establishment, is also very much an important piece of the story when you're playing that kind of game.
So that cultural war is happening right now in America and in Western society, because it's not just in America. This is a symptom of the BritX and the other things going on in different countries.
Right.
And, if we don't understand this war is going on, it's entirely possible our business might get, collateral damage from what's happening.
Yes. I would say with absolute certainty. The magnitude of this is way too large to not have collateral effects on all businesses, certainly businesses above a certain order of magnitude in size. What's interesting is because this is so big, it will actually tend to affect really big companies like, say, Google, who otherwise would be largely unaffected because they're strong enough to kind of hold. Even the biggest companies are going to be affected by this, which is one of the reasons why they're starting to get very nervous.
I think this is something really important for people to grasp. Let's go back to the shallow end of the pool. What are some concrete actions you'd recommend people taking to take opportunity from this cultural war or to protect their assets?
Well, I mean, a lot of that, of course, depends on where you're positioned in the world. What we can say for certain is a couple of things. The first is that people are going to be attending to these issues. So if your business is a business that relates to individuals' psychology, their sense of safety, their sense of well-being, their sense of being empowered, there's, in some sense, obvious opportunities that emerge there, some of which are going to be sort of unfortunate abilities to exploit people, which I would recommend people avoid, but many of which are, in fact, going to be absolutely necessary mechanisms to help people find ways to respond to what is absolutely going to be an increasingly chaotic and increasingly intensely distressful environment. Things are going to make less and less sense and seem more and more dangerous over the next several years. And so if your business is something that can help people respond to that, and it can be anything, right? It can be yoga. It can be personal development techniques. It can be ways to get people to interact with other people in physical lived space. It can be more effective pathways to personal nutrition, which makes the body more able to respond to its environment. A very large number of ways that you can tap into that. That's one set of vectors. Second, because we can say with some confidence that the macro environment is going to become more turbulent, so think of this like boiling water and turbulence, being able to construct your business organization deeply around a fundamental ability to respond to increasingly rapid and unpredictable change will enable you to radically outcompete even vastly more well-resourced businesses that are slow to respond. So really being able to grok this idea of what it means to have a high bandwidth OODA loop, which has, for example, low dependencies. So having a limited amount of commitment to cash flow. So if you have, for example, a choice between hiring a full-time staff or enabling it to, connecting with some studio model where you have some sort of expertise that can come in, that if you have to turn it off tomorrow, you can. The latter is a more rational choice than the former. To the degree possible, allowing the ambient environment to give you very rapid feedback. So there's a premium in the contemporary environment to not being delusional. By that I mean, so for example, special forces, people who are day traders, certain emergency physicians tend to be the kinds of people who are actually rather quite aware of what's going on right now because the business they're in, the lifestyle that they're in, requires them to not make a lot of shit up and believe their own nonsense. They just have to, because reality will very quickly tell them they were wrong. Being able to build in yourself a capacity to very rapidly be able to just test, experiment, allow reality to tell you what's happening, and then respond to that, as opposed to trying to create a narrative that makes sense of reality, which may in fact be a delusion and distracts you from reality. It's another deep core competency. So, for example, this might mean instead of investing in a long cycle marketing plan that is based upon a whole bunch of untested hypotheses that may take a year before you get any signal back, and the world, it may have been a perfectly valid plan by the time you launched it. By the time the signal comes back, the world may have changed. Focus on finding ways to do things at a very rapid iteration. You can get a very rapid feedback from the world to tell you what things are going in a certain direction, and then respond to that, and then iterate again quickly. Would, for example, be a way to be adapted to the contemporary environment.
And a perfect example of that is the 7-day startup movement, where you get the whole startup and get to a proof of concept with a prototype within 7 days, in order to get feedback as to whether you should modify it and continue it, or whether you should scrap it and do something else. So, and then
we can talk about all kinds of other ones. If you're in a space where being a very effective what the heck is this called? Like the little fish that clean the teeth of the sharks. Because of the big guys are now going to get shaken up like crazy, and they're not going to be able to respond effectively internally because it requires a change in the nature of who they are. There will be a substantial amount of opportunity that opens up around facilitating bigger guys. So B2B plays that help large companies be more responsive to the contemporary environment, whether these are old-fashioned consulting gigs or finding places where big companies are not doing a good job and intense tool around that. There will be opportunity there as well, for as long as those companies survive, and being positioned to actually eat market share that falls off of large companies that are becoming less and less adapted to the environment is sort of a fundamental strategy.